Let me tell you a story. So one time, while playing the Battle Cats as normal, I was bored and thought of an idea. What if I speedran the Battle Cats? My goal was to reach the end of Stories of Legend as fast as possible. This was back in 2020, before a lot of power creep existed that would end up making Stories of Legend trivial, like Courier and the Special Cat talents. This was also before Easy Speezy made his video on speedrunning Empire of Cats, which may have drawn more attention to speedrunning the game in general, and before Mint did his own Stories of Legend in-game time speedrun. But anyways, I did end up speedrunning this game, starting somewhere at the end of April, and I finished on August 6th. Now, taking over 3 months for a speedrun might have sounded like a lot, and it was. The run was heavily unoptimized, especially since I hadn't seen anyone do it before. But anyways, during my run I was playing the stages as normal, and I reached a pretty infamous Stories of Legend stage, Caliban's Keeper. Because of how I was playing, I didn't have what I needed to actually beat the stage. I didn't have Paris or Drama, and my basics were so low leveled that I didn't even have Eraser, Macho Legs, or King Dragon. I only had Crazed Dragon and Legs with Holy Valkyrie, as well as Pizza, Seafarer, and Volter from Gacha. But that wasn't enough because the Arost was pushing especially hard without Eraser, causing Pizza and Seafarer to sometimes not be able to land those hits. I needed more consistent damage to win. So, what unit do you think I pulled out to get me through this roadblock? Fencer. So, Fencer is not a unit you might assume would work here at first glance. Looking at the abilities, Fencer is meant to break barriers at a guaranteed chance, except nothing has a barrier in this stage. As a general attacker, Fencer wasn't very well liked due to only having a knockback count of 1. This essentially means that if any enemy ever reaches him, he kinda just dies. Combined with a pretty low amount of health, and he's not gonna work as a tank either. Another problem about Fencer is that he's a really long attack animation, and when you combine those two aspects together, you get a unit who can sometimes just die before he even lands a single hit. However, in his true form, his attack animation was shortened, and his stats were overall improved, which made him a lot more usable, but he still wasn't really used that much. Liberty did end up being an important unit to help me beat Caliban's Keeper, as he had pretty good damage and outranged Arost, giving me enough damage to kill him before the second Arost could cause any problems. But Caliban's Keeper is just one of many stages, so let's analyze what else he has going for him. First of all, the main selling point for Liberty is his damage. At level 30, he does 17.8k damage per hit, 4,800 DPS at 320 standing range. Compared to something similar, it's about 1.58 times the DPS of Manic King Dragon at the same level. This sounds good, but we do know that Manic King Dragon stands at 415 range, which is almost 100 more. Combined with having more HP and a higher knockback count, the average MKD will most likely live longer and output more damage individually than a single Liberty. However, Liberty does have a very important advantage over MKD, and that is in the cost and cooldown. Liberty only costs 825 to spawn compared to MKD's 1500, which is almost half of it. Likewise, the cooldown of Liberty is 9.2 seconds, which compared to MKD's 16.87 is again almost twice as good. This gives Liberty a very distinct role and an ability to set him apart from MKD. Liberty is both a more cost-efficient option for damage when it comes to things they both outrange, and Liberty can start putting damage on the field faster due to its faster cooldown. Of course, at the end of the day, I'm not saying that one unit here is always better or worse than the other, but rather that Liberty does have time to shine on certain situations. For example, against enemies which he outranges, he can be a very useful damager for when you need a cost-efficient and high damage attacker. Back to Caliban's Keeper, Liberty is a very useful unit to use versus Arost in general, meaning you can bring him on stages like 8k Fertilizer and Last Labyrinth from Stories of Legend, or Stars in the Sewers and Glass Slippers from Uncanny Legends. Looking closer at some of these stages, you can also see another strength of Liberty being used here, which is his cost efficiency. Because Liberty has a low cost and cooldown, there isn't too much of a downside to losing him, even if he only lands 1 or 2 hits. He works great on Realm of Carnage because of this, since when you normally bring dragons to deal with Arost, they end up dying in one shot anyways after Arost is knocked back. Liberty's low knockback count, despite being a core weakness, can also be a strength in certain scenarios. You can tank through weak chip damage from some LD attacks like Dolphina and Mr. Mole, or ability-based attacks like Pigeon Waves or Sinner Stage Surges without getting knocked back. On the topic of peons, Liberty's base damage is high enough to end up one-shotting peons like Pigeons or Brawlos at certain magnifications and levels, and can two-shot most other peons with a high enough level. This means he can work great on some stages like Subterranean Stalker, Houses of the Holy, and Cloned Farmers. He also works against enemies like Dober PD, as he can continue to function in case of a random wave. At this point you might ask to yourself, Liberty actually sounds really good. Why was he so underrated? And to answer that question, he actually isn't. Nowadays you see Liberty pop up now and then in stages without barriers, and it is a lot more common than back in 2020. Looking at what changed, the talents he received were a complete joke and essentially did nothing. You might assume that people simply figured out that he was good over time, and that is the most likely reason. However, I have a theory on why Liberty actually became more meta, and it comes down to something that doesn't even have to do with him. Not good talents, orbs, buffs, not even a new stage where Liberty did well on. It all comes down to one particular unit, and that unit is Dancer Cat. So Dancer Cat is the true form of Kung Fu Cat, which is a purchasable special cat. He was used very sparingly in the old days, but when he received talents with all the other purchasable special cats, Dancer with talents became an absolute beast of a unit. Talents maxed at just level 30, he's 5.2k DPS and 37,000 damage per hit. Talents also give him some more abilities, such as a 20% chance to create a level 1 surge, and full immunities to freeze and wave. Combined with his natural weaken immunity, he already seems like a strong option. But the main thing to look at here is that Dancer, like Liberty, has just one knockback count, and they even stand at almost the exact same range. When Dancer's talents came out, they made him an incredibly strong unit that could be used in lots of scenarios. Players were inclined to pick him up and use him, which made them more comfortable with using one knockback units that are meant to get in a few hits and die. Dancer's abilities also give him a shared use with Liberty, as Liberty could already be used against weak wave enemies, and now Dancer can be used against basically any of them. When players learned how to use Dancer, they were also simultaneously learning about how to use Liberty, which made Liberty make more sense to use, and thus brought him into the meta. Of course, Dancer does overshadow Liberty as a result. With higher DPS, health, more immunities, and a bonus surge, Dancer is used a lot more often than Liberty. But Liberty does have his own advantages though, such as being more cost efficient and easier to replace. But Dancer does take on more roles and just is a higher priority to upgrade, which might leave Liberty in the dust. But enough of Liberty. The video title says underrated units. Who else do we have that is underrated? Well, let's take a look at what used to be and maybe still is the poster boy of underrated units. Or should I say, poster girl. Juliet the Maiko is another super rare like Liberty, which is the true form of Juliet Cat. Juliet the Maiko stands at 250 range, the same amount as Cameraman, and has a 40% chance to freeze angels for 4 seconds. Juliet the Maiko has a really high DPS for what it is, being 4.2k at level 30, which is higher than other similar super rare mid-rangers including Slapstick, Seafarer, and even Pizza Cat, who is known for having a very good damage output. Juliet's survivability isn't bad either, with 21k HP at level 30 and 3 knockbacks. 825 cost and 7.5 cooldown makes the unit build up DPS fast and be decently cost efficient. So what gives? Why is this unit not used that much? Well, it has one major problem, and that is one similar to Liberty's pre-true form Fencer, where they have an incredibly long attack animation startup. For reference, Fencer's attack animation startup takes 1.7 seconds before the damage is dealt, which is very problematic. 1.7 seconds can be the difference between landing a shot and just outright dying for a unit like Fencer, but luckily for him, it got buffed in true form, only taking 0.7 seconds before it can dish out damage. Now Juliet, on the other hand, has a whopping 2.33 whole seconds before their attack animation startup finishes. This is gigantic for a mid-ranged unit, and makes Juliet's damage really inconsistent, as a lot of the time versus hard-pushing enemies, Juliet won't even finish her attack in time and will simply be interrupted and knocked back. Comparing this to another cat, Can, a widely used strong unit that already suffers from this sometimes, has an attack animation that takes 1.2 seconds to start. Juliet's is almost twice as long, and you can imagine how big of a problem that actually is. And unlike Liberty, whose true form fixed this problem, Juliet's true form didn't, and she is stuck with one of the most painful attack startups in the game, especially considering she stands at 250 range. She can be relatively close to the enemies, which leads to getting her interrupted a lot. There's also another problem that occurs as a result of the long attack animation. Because Juliet takes so long to prepare her attack, when paired with other attackers, they can knock enemies back and cause Juliet to miss. Well, this can happen with any unit you use, but it is especially prominent with Juliet, as the enemy simply needs to be knocked back within a time window of a full 2.33 seconds. When fighting enemies with mid to low range that you would use Juliet on, they generally tend to have a higher knockback count anyways, leaving Juliet in a tough spot. What's so good about having one of the highest theoretical DPS numbers, when you just end up getting your attack interrupted and end up missing the enemy very often? Juliet's case is a pretty sad tale, because this is really the only main thing holding this unit back from being pretty good as a generalist. Sure, you could say that the range is a bit lacking, but we've seen 250 range be decent enough for other mid-rangers like Camera and Courier, and not to mention the fact that Juliet is technically more cost efficient in raw damage than Cameraman, a unit already well known for being very cost efficient. But the force wing on Juliet is the big separator for being on the same tier as all the other good mid-ranged units. Juliet also has an additional ability, being Freezing Angels at a 40% chance for 4 seconds. Freezing Angels sounds good, and while the ability would be good versus Angels, Juliet suffers from both compatibility and being outclassed. Looking at Angel enemies, most of the enemies that Juliet can outrange are the low-ranged pusher enemies and peons, like Gabriel, Heavenly Hippo, and Angelic Gory. There are some other enemies as well, such as Borfim and Saint Tober. It sounds pretty good so far, but there is competition for crowd control on these enemies. Sanzo is a rare cat that can slow Angels after talents at a 20% chance, with a much faster attack rate and cooldown, which ends up being more consistent at getting off its status effects on the enemies than Juliet. While Freeze is a stronger effect than Slow, for most of these enemies, Slow is good enough to render them non-threats, with one exception being Saint Dober. Saint Dober is an enemy that has a chance to create a surge attack, which will end up hitting your units for big damage. If you slow Saint Dober and your meat shields still reach him, he will still make surges that can splash onto your other units. But if you freeze him with Juliet, then he won't be able to make these surges, and your stack of units will be in a safer position. This has essentially relegated Juliet in modern times to somewhat of a slave to Saint Dober, where you bring out Juliet to deal with Saint Dober and then never again versus anything else. Funnily enough, some other Angel enemies where Freeze would be really good against would be Angelic Sleipnir, to stop it from knocking back your units and making it easier to rush, and Winged Piggy, which you can stop from doing its Omni Strike weakening attack. But unfortunately, Juliet doesn't outrange either of these enemies. Well, in Winged Piggy's case, it doesn't outrange the Omni Strike range, but either way, this is just an example of the compatibility issue. Juliet's talents aren't the absolute worst, but from how talents work, there inevitably wouldn't be anything to fix Juliet's Force Wing. Speed Up is the most interesting, making Juliet the fastest out of all mid-range super rare units and just mid-rangers in general. This used to give Juliet a niche and somewhat of a more unique identity, except that high speed on mid-rangers wasn't exactly something in high demand or practicality. You could still get away with it to help dodging LD in False Resurrection or Lonely Goldfish, but those stages weren't the biggest threats anyways. And well, nowadays we have Courier, another unit at 250 range that also moves very fast, but with bonus LD and just broken tier stats, meaning that Juliet goes back to the trash can. Although you could potentially bring out Juliet on stages where you normally bring most mid-rangers, I don't see it as being practical unless you happen to be extraordinarily unlucky with your gacha, and somehow don't roll every single other good mid-ranger. But if you do, then Juliet is something you can manage to work with. After all, Crazed Bahamut has a massive force swing, but because we had to use him to progress in the early days, we learned to make it work. Maybe in the future, we will find more enemies that Juliet pairs well against, and enter a Juliet meta. But for now, Juliet is just a pretty decent unit that is kind of outshined by a lot of units. You know, I was originally gonna talk about Godcat here, but I think I'll relegate him to a second video for no gacha units. But anyways, thanks for watching. If you have any other units you think you're underrated, tell me in the comments. I might take a look at some and even make a video on them if I find them interesting. And well, that's it for the video, I guess.